The storm had no mercy. Snow swept across the empty main street of Lone Hollow, swirling in pale sheets that made the lamps burn weak and dim, their glow lost against the white. Every door was bolted, every curtain drawn, but behind the frosted windows shadows stirred, faces pressed to the glass, eager to glimpse the girl staggering alone through the storm. Chenoa Whitebird's shawl was soaked and stiff with ice, her braid unraveling against her cheek, her breath ragged as if she carried the weight of the town's gossip in her lungs. Each step broke through the crusted snow with a crunch that echoed louder than it should, a sound that seemed to mark her as guilty, even though she had committed no crime. Her name had been spoken too often that day in voices sharp with judgment. A rancher's son had been caught boasting after drink, his tale laced with lies that spread like prairie fire, leaving her branded by shame she had not earned. The women whispered she was ruined. The men muttered that she was easy prey. No one had listened when she tried to speak. She had been turned from the tavern door by Ruthie May herself, told to keep her head low and pray. But prayer gave no warmth, and the night grew colder with each minute. Her legs failed her near the edge of town. She stumbled, the hem of her dress heavy with frost, knees plunging into the drift. The sky pressed low, gray and merciless, snowflakes biting her lashes like needles. Her hands trembled as she tried to rise, but she sank again, her palms buried in the cold powder. She thought in a hollow way that perhaps this was how it would end. Her body swallowed by the snow, her shame erased by silence. Maybe the wind would carry her away where no one would laugh at her name. But the wind carried something else. The creak of leather, the crunch of deliberate steps, the breath of a man unbothered by the storm. She lifted her head weakly, and through the veil of snow she saw him. He stood shirtless in the blizzard, as if carved from some darker element than the storm itself. His skin, bronze against the whiteness, glistened with frost that clung to the breadth of his shoulders. His black hair, long and wild, whipped about his face, and his eyes, dark as riverstone, locked on her with a gaze that did not waver. He moved with a stillness that was its own power, each step purposeful, silent, as though the earth itself yielded before him. Chenoa's heart lurched with fear. She had heard whispers of Apache scouts seen near the ridges, tales spun in saloons of raiders who moved like shadows. To find herself alone before one now felt like a cruel twist of fate. She tried to rise, to flee, but her legs would not hold. The storm tore at her shawl, leaving her small and fragile before him. He knelt without a word, his shadow falling across her, vast and unyielding. She flinched, expecting roughness, but his hand only brushed the snow from her cheek, his palm wide and calloused yet strangely gentle. His breath mingled with hers in the frozen air, and then he leaned closer, his voice low enough that it might have been carried by the storm itself. "I'm going to be your slave," he whispered, in accented English, each word deliberate, as though spoken from a place deeper than mere speech. "You just don't know it yet." Her lips parted, but no sound came. The words confused her, frightened her, but something in their weight pressed against the ache of her loneliness. A vow, not a threat. His tone held no mockery, no lust, only certainty. She tried to protest, to push him away, but her body betrayed her, trembling with exhaustion. He gathered her into his arms, lifting her as though she weighed less than the storm's snowflakes. His chest was warm against her, impossibly warm for a man bare in such weather. She turned her face against him, breath caught between fear and surrender. Behind the frosted window of the tavern, Ruthie May watched with narrowed eyes. She saw the giant Apache stride into the blizzard carrying the fallen girl, and her mouth curled with scorn. "So that's where she's gone," she muttered to the silent patrons inside. "Shame finds shame. Let the snow have them both." Her words carried and heads nodded, glad for the story to tell. Already the tale was shaping itself. Chenoa Whitebird, ruined twice over, stolen by a savage. The storm swallowed them quickly, the cabin of firelight tucked far beyond the last fence of town. Chenoa lay cradled against the man's arm, every breath of his chest steady as a drum. She watched his profile in the dim light, jaw strong, nose scarred from some old break, eyes fixed on a place unseen. The snow battered him, but he did not falter, did not bend. Her mind spun with questions. Why would he carry her? Why speak such words to her, as though her worth still existed? She wanted to resist, to demand he let her down, but her body betrayed her with each shiver, each gasp. She had been discarded by her own people, left to freeze under their whispers, and now she was borne away by a man they called enemy. The shame of it stung, but within that sting was something else, something harder to name: relief. The storm quieted as they neared the dark line of trees. Snow bent the branches low, the world muffled in white silence. At last, he pushed open the door of a small cabin tucked in the woods. Warmth struck her face, fire crackling in the hearth. He lowered her onto a bed of furs by the flames, her breath fogging in the sudden heat. For a long moment he only stood, watching her with that same unbroken gaze, then turned to stir the fire. Sparks rose, gilding the shadows with fleeting gold. His silence was heavy, yet it did not feel empty. It was as though he spoke in the spaces between his actions. Chenoa lay trembling, uncertain whether she had been saved or captured, whether she had fallen into danger or into fate. The words he had whispered still burned in her ears, puzzling, frightening, impossible to shake. Outside, the snow thickened again, sealing them in as if the storm itself had decreed their fates were now bound. She closed her eyes, the fire's warmth against her face, his shadow moving across the room. For the first time since she had been cast out, she did not feel entirely alone. Yet dread lingered sharp as frost. She opened her eyes once more, and found him kneeling before the fire, sharpening a blade with slow, steady strokes. The steel caught the firelight in flashes, his face unreadable in the glow. And though he had not spoken again, his first words seemed to echo louder than the storm outside, a promise or a curse she could not yet understand. The fire hummed low, its crackle filling the silence as Chenoa sat wrapped in a rough blanket, her skin still shivering though warmth now pressed against her. She had not slept, though the storm had passed into the small hours of dawn. Every time her eyes closed she saw faces, smirks at the tavern, the sharp tilt of Ruthie May's voice, Silas Ward's mocking grin when she had been turned away. Those memories clung tighter than the frost on her lashes. She touched her own hands as if to confirm they were still hers, not stolen by the gossip that had stripped her dignity. Taza moved without sound, a figure more shadow than flesh. He poured water into a clay cup, placed it by her side, and returned to the fire. Not once had he asked her name. Not once had he questioned why she had fallen in the snow. His silence unnerved her, yet it was different from the town's silence. Their silence had been full of scorn, this one full of watchfulness, as though he waited for something to grow out of the ashes she carried. She forced herself to speak, her voice thin. "They think I'm ruined." Her words trembled in the air, brittle as icicles. He did not answer, only looked at her, and she hated herself for how quickly her eyes fell to the ground under that gaze. "Even if I go back," she murmured, "there's no place for me." She thought he might not understand, but the flicker in his eyes told her he did. He broke bread and held it out. The gesture stilled her. In town, men offered things with expectation. Here, the bread lay in his open palm, like an offering stripped of demand. She reached, hesitant, and his hand brushed hers just long enough for her to feel the roughness of scars that spoke of battles survived. She chewed slowly, tasting not flour but the strangeness of kindness. The firelight carved his features, hard jaw, straight nose, the scar across his cheekbone, and she realized his silence was not emptiness but choice. He had chosen to give without binding her in words. Still, the weight of the town pressed on her chest. Even here, she felt their eyes. In Lone Hollow, Ruthie May was already busy. By the tavern stove she stoked her tail, feeding it until it burned bright enough for all to see. "Carried off she was," Ruthie declared, her voice sharp as a poker iron. "By one of them Apaches. You saw him. Tall as a pine, half naked in the storm. And she went with him. Oh yes she did, didn't fight near as hard as a decent girl ought to." The women listening exchanged knowing looks, relief in their smirks. Better her than them. The men grunted, some with pity, others with sly satisfaction. Sheriff Malden Crow leaned in the doorway, his hat pulled low. He listened, but his eyes narrowed, not in agreement but in unease. He had seen Chenoa's father buried, had watched her grow from child to woman. He knew Ruthie's tongue cut deeper than any blade. Yet he said nothing, for the weight of a sheriff's word could not still the tide of gossip once it swelled. Silas Ward slammed his glass down. "I'll fetch her back," he spat, his pride wounded from the day before when she had rejected his offer of work and shelter laced with something darker. "She don't belong with savages. She belongs where men can keep her." The room erupted in laughter, though the sheriff's frown deepened. Back in the cabin, Chenoa pulled the blanket tighter. Shame flushed her skin, though no one was there to accuse her. She whispered, as if confessing to herself, "They'll say I chose this." Her eyes flicked to Taza, expecting to find judgment. Instead, he was grinding herbs, his hands steady, movements precise. He placed the mixture near the fire, the steam rising with a bitter scent, and handed the cup to her. She hesitated, then drank. Warmth spread through her chest, loosening the ache. "You don't speak," she said finally, watching him. "Do you think me foolish?" His gaze rose to hers, steady and unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he spoke only 2 words. "Storm passes." The simplicity of it struck her. Not dismissal, not mockery, only truth. Storms did pass. Her eyes burned, not with shame this time but with something rawer, harder to name. By dusk, the cabin walls glowed amber. Taza returned with game strung over his shoulder, snow melting across his skin. She busied herself with the fire, awkward, clumsy, yet eager to prove she was not a burden. He noticed but said nothing, only placed meat in her hands as if declaring trust. She roasted it, her fingers trembling, the scent filling the cabin like a promise of survival. When she finally dared to meet his eyes across the fire, something shifted inside her. She saw not a captor, but a man carrying exile as heavy as her own. She realized then that his whispered vow, that he would be her slave, was not born of domination but of sacrifice. He had placed himself beside her shame, not above it. The thought unsettled her, yet some hidden corner of her heart warmed to it. But beyond the cabin walls, the storm of gossip swelled. Ruthie may spread her story from porch to church, from market to saloon. By lantern light, Silas gathered men with whispers of reclaiming what was rightfully theirs. The town's scorn grew into resolve, a fire that demanded fuel. Sheriff Crow sat alone in his office, the lamplight flickering. He turned his badge over in his hand, thinking of Chenoa's face pale in the snow. He had seen no fear when she looked at the Apache, only something closer to defiance. He wondered if the law served justice, or only the loudest voices. Night returned, and in the cabin Chenoa lay on furs by the fire, her eyes tracing the rafters. Sleep came in fragments. She dreamed of torchlight outside, of voices shouting her name, of hands reaching. When she startled awake, the fire was low, and Taza sat watchful at the door, his bow across his knees, his gaze fixed on the forest beyond. The night pressed close, heavy with silence. She knew then the storm was not finished, it was only gathering shape. And when it broke, it would not be of snow but of men. Snow thickened in the forest, draping branches in white silence, as though the world itself had grown hushed to watch what unfolded between them. Days passed, marked not by words but by gestures, small, quiet acts that began to stitch their lives together in ways neither had expected. Chenoa awoke each morning to the sound of fire already crackling, the scent of meat roasting on the spit, or herbs steeping in a clay pot. She would turn and find Taza already at work, shirtless even in the bitter cold, his muscles taut as he split wood or tended traps. She never heard him rise in the night, yet the cabin bore his presence like a shield. Every creak of timber seemed steadied by him, every draft softened by his silence. She wished for words to fill the distance, but when none came, she found herself listening differently. To the rhythm of his knife against hide, to the way he breathed evenly when the storm beat loud, to the steady thud of his boots as he returned with food. His language was one of constancy, and she slowly began to understand it. One evening, she tried to repay him. With hands clumsy but determined, she gathered flour and lard from a sack near the wall, and kneaded dough before the fire. Her palms stuck, her fingers pressed too hard, and she cursed softly under her breath. Taza paused, watching. She braced for him to take over, but instead he set a wooden bowl beside her, filled with warm water, and stepped back. His gaze told her what his mouth did not. He believed she could do it. Her chest tightened with something sharp and sweet. She made bread that night, coarse and uneven, but when he broke it, he ate in silence as though it were feast enough. For the first time since her disgrace in town, she felt capable of giving rather than only receiving. At dusk, when the sky bruised purple, he repaired her torn dress. She protested weakly. "That is not your work." But he threaded sinew through cloth with patience, his broad fingers precise. The fire cast gold on his scarred hands, and she realized each stitch was not an act of pride, but of quiet offering. The thread bound not just fabric, but something inside her that had been left undone for too long. When she hummed an old tune by the fire, a lullaby her mother had once sung, she thought he might ignore it. Yet his hand slowed on the bowstring he was mending, and though he gave no sign beyond that pause, she sensed the song had reached him. It was then she began to believe his whispered vow, the strange words in the snow, that he would be her slave. He was binding himself to her survival, not chaining her with desire but with devotion. But the world beyond their cabin pressed closer. On the third day, hoofbeats cracked the silence. Sheriff Crow appeared at the tree line, 2 deputies at his back, their coats dusted with frost. Chenoa's heart clutched at her ribs. Taza rose, bow in hand, his frame tall in the doorway. The sheriff called out, his voice steady but burdened. "Girl, your people say you're here against your will. I've come to take you back." His eyes found hers, searching, almost pleading for her to give him reason. Fear burned in her throat. Behind her, the warmth of the fire. Before her, the cold judgment of town. She trembled, then stepped forward until her shoulder brushed Taza's arm. She did not speak loudly, but the words carried all the same. "I stay." The deputies shifted, startled. The sheriff's jaw hardened, yet his eyes betrayed doubt. He studied her, then the man beside her, and after a long silence he said only, "This won't end here." He turned, the crunch of snow fading until the forest reclaimed its hush. Chenoa's knees weakened, but Taza did not move. His bow stayed lowered, his breath steady. She leaned slightly against him, as though the weight of her decision needed his strength to stand. It was a moment fragile as glass, but it held. That night, she could not sleep. She lay awake, listening to the wind groan against the walls, her heart thrumming with fear of what was to come. Taza sat by the fire, sharpening a blade in slow, measured strokes. At last, she whispered into the dark, "They will come again." His eyes lifted, meeting hers across the glow. No words followed, only the faintest nod, as if to say he had always known. His silence should have frightened her, but instead it steadied her. She realized that while gossip raged like fire outside, in here the quiet was strong enough to withstand it. In the days that followed, she began to walk beside him when he checked snares. At first her steps faltered in the snow, but he slowed without showing impatience. She learned to read his gestures, the tilt of his chin toward rabbit tracks, the press of his palm against a tree when danger stirred. He never scolded when she erred, only showed again, his patience and unspoken faith. One afternoon, as dusk dimmed the sky, he returned carrying wood. She reached for a log to help, her fingers brushing his as she took the weight. For a moment they stood close, breath mingling in the cold, and something unspoken passed between them. She turned quickly, cheeks hot, but her heart carried the warmth long after. The bond grew in silence, layer by layer. It was not the loud hunger she had feared from men in town. It was steadier, deeper, like the way snow pressed into earth until roots felt its weight. She found herself glancing at him not with fear, but with something far more dangerous, hope. Yet hope was fragile, for outside, Ruthie Mae's whispers fanned the town into fever. Silas Ward stoked the fire with promises to reclaim what was his by right, and men eager for coin and cruelty sharpened their knives. Their voices grew louder, torches brighter, until Lone Hollow brimmed with resolve. On the fourth night, Chenoa knelt by the fire, her hands folded though no prayer left her lips. She turned to Taza, meaning to speak, to thank him, perhaps, or to ask what lay in his heart, but stopped. He had drawn near without sound, his shadow stretching across the floor. For the first time since she had entered his cabin, she dared to meet his eyes fully. They were dark, steady, and held something she had not seen in any gaze before. Not judgment, not pity, but recognition. She felt as if he had looked into her shame and seen not ruin, but strength waiting to rise. Her breath caught. Before she could shape words, a sound split the night, a distant murmur, low but growing, the sound of many voices carried by the wind. She froze, eyes widening, and he reached for his bow. The bond forged in silence would soon be tested in fire. The first light of dawn bled faintly through the storm, painting the snow in pale rose and ash. The cabin walls creaked with the weight of the night, but it was not wind that stirred Chenoa from sleep. She opened her eyes to the low hum of voices outside, a ripple of sound that grew heavier with each breath. She sat up, heart pounding, and saw Taza already by the door, bow strung, his body taut as if he had been waiting for this hour all along. Through the frost on the window, she glimpsed torches wavering in the gray light. The town had come. Shapes moved in the trees. Men bundled in coats, rifles slung, eyes glinting with a fever that came not from justice but from gossip sharpened into rage. Ruthie Mae's voice rang sharp across the snow, her words biting the air. "Come out, girl. You don't belong to him. You belong with your own." Chenoa's breath caught. The town that had abandoned her now demanded her return, not to restore her, but to reclaim their claim on her shame. She looked to Taza. His face was carved from stone, unyielding, yet she sensed the storm inside him, the knowledge that this was no mere quarrel but a trial of who they were allowed to be. Sheriff Crow stepped forward, badge catching the pale light. He raised his hand to still the voices, though they barely listened. "Chenoa Whitebird," he called, his tone measured. "You're accused of being held against your will. If you step forward, we'll take you home." The word home twisted inside her. What home had she left? The tavern doors had shut her out. The women had spat on her name. Silas Ward's greedy smirk waited in every corner of town. She turned toward the fire, searching for courage. Taza's shadow loomed beside her, steady, silent. She rose, her legs trembling, and touched his arm lightly, her signal that she must face them herself. The door groaned open, and the cold struck her like a blade. Barefoot in the snow, her dress whipping in the bitter wind, she stepped out into the dawn. Gasps cut through the crowd. Her hair tangled in the stormlight, her skin pale but her eyes alive with a fire she had not felt in weeks. "She's bewitched," Ruthie Mae hissed, clutching her shawl as if Chenoa's strength were poison. Chenoa's voice shook, but she forced it into the open. "I am not his prisoner. I walk by choice." Laughter broke from Silas Ward, cruel and guttural. "Choice?" he sneered, stepping forward, his rifle gleaming. "What choice does a ruined girl have but to cling to the first savage that'll have her? Come now, Chenoa, don't dress shame as dignity." His words sliced the air, and the crowd roared with agreement, their judgment crackling like fire against dry brush. Her throat tightened, but she lifted her chin. "If survival is shame," she cried, "then let shame be my salvation. For it was not you who gave me bread when I was cast aside. Not you who lifted me from the snow. Not you who saw me as worth keeping alive." Her breath fogged in the cold, her eyes bright with tears that did not fall. The crowd faltered, their voices dimming. Yet Ruthie Mae pressed harder, her voice shrill. "Don't be fooled. He's taken her to taunt us. She's blinded by fear." But Chenoa did not falter. She took another step forward, the snow burning her skin, until she stood close enough that Silas's eyes narrowed with rage. "I fear nothing more than your pity," she whispered fiercely. Silas's hand darted to her wrist, rough and possessive. She gasped, trying to pull away, but he tightened his grip, turning to the crowd. "See? She's confused. She belongs to us, not to him." The next moment struck like lightning. Taza moved, silent and sudden, his bow drawn with an arrow leveled at Silas's chest. His body towered against the dawn, hair whipping in the wind, every line of him alive with the promise of violence held in check only by will. The crowd gasped, torches wavering. Sheriff Crow raised a hand, his voice sharp now. "Enough!" His eyes flicked from Silas to Taza, then to Chenoa. Something shifted in his gaze, the weight of doubt turning into reluctant recognition. He saw not a captive, but a woman standing beside her protector. The mob murmured, uncertainty spreading. Some lowered their rifles. Yet Silas would not yield. His pride burned hotter than reason. He shoved Chenoa back, raising his weapon, his finger twitching against the trigger. In that instant, time slowed. Chenoa stumbled, snow rising around her. Taza's bowstring creaked, drawn tighter, his eyes narrowed with lethal calm. The crowd froze, breath caught, every heartbeat suspended between ruin and salvation. Then the sheriff stepped forward, hand on his holster but voice steady. "Silas Ward," he barked, "lower your gun. This ends in blood if you don't." The authority in his tone silenced even Ruthie May's tongue. Silas's jaw worked, fury blazing, but the sight of the sheriff's hand and the arrow aimed at his heart forced his arm to tremble. Slowly, with a curse spat into the snow, he lowered his rifle. Chenoa gasped, clutching her chest, the cold biting deeper now that fear had loosened its hold. She turned to Taza, whose bow remained drawn, his body still a storm of control. For a moment, she feared he would release, end the conflict with one strike. But then his breath eased, and he lowered the weapon. The restraint in that motion spoke louder than violence. The sheriff faced the crowd. "Go home," he ordered. "This trial isn't yours to hold." One by one, the townsfolk drifted back, torches snuffed in the snow, their whispers fading into the trees. Ruthie May lingered, her eyes sharp with venom, before finally turning away. Silas spat once more, promising silently that this wound was not finished. The dawn returned to quiet, the forest once again a shroud of pale light and breathless cold. Chenoa stood trembling in the snow, her bare feet burning, her heart torn between terror and relief. She looked at Taza, who still watched the empty tree line, his chest rising slow and steady. She realized then that the storm outside had only begun to mirror the storm within. The town's judgment had not been ended, only delayed. And the bond forged in silence now stood against fire that could not be turned aside. When she reached for his hand, seeking anchor, his fingers closed around hers with a strength that promised both burden and devotion. She shuddered, not from cold, but from the weight of knowing she had bound herself to him before the eyes of her enemies. And just as the first true rays of sun broke over the ridge, a single horn call echoed from beyond the forest, low and foreign, unlike the town's. Taza's head lifted sharply, eyes narrowing. It was not the voice of Lone Hollow that called to them now. It was something older, wilder, and nearer than she had ever feared. The horn's echo hung in the frozen air like a wound that refused to close. Chenoa clutched Taza's hand tighter, her breath stuttering in the cold. The crowd from Lone Hollow had already scattered, yet the sound that followed was not theirs. It came again, low and steady, a call that belonged to no town. Taza's face shifted, shadow crossing his dark eyes. He stepped forward into the snow, bow in hand, every muscle taut. "Who is it?" Chenoa whispered, but he gave no answer. The silence told her enough. Whatever had come, it would test them more deeply than the torches had. From the trees, a figure emerged. Silas Ward, reckless pride driving him, had not returned home with the others. He carried a rifle still, his mouth twisted with fury. "Thought you could shame me before my town?" He spat. "I'll not leave empty-handed." He lifted the barrel, not at Taza but at her. The world narrowed to a single breath. Chenoa froze, the memory of every cruel word, every shut door, every whisper pressing down on her shoulders. But Taza moved with the speed of thunder. His arrow loosed, striking the rifle clean from Silas's grasp. The weapon spun into the snow, and Silas stumbled back, face pale. The forest quieted. Only the whisper of wind through the branches remained. Silas stood trembling, stripped of power. His eyes flicked between them, wide with something closer to fear than rage. Then he turned and fled into the trees, his footprints vanishing quickly beneath the falling snow. Chenoa exhaled, knees weak. She looked at Taza, whose chest heaved once, then stilled. He had not killed, though he could have. That restraint spoke louder than death. She realized then what his whispered vow had meant. Not a promise of possession, but a surrender. He would bind himself to her burdens, endure them as though they were his own chains. The sheriff's words returned in her mind. "This isn't yours to hold." Yet here he was, holding it with her, against every storm. She stepped closer, trembling, her hand reaching for his arm. His skin was warm despite the cold, his strength steady beneath her touch. He looked at her then, finally meeting her eyes with a gaze that was neither fierce nor guarded, but vulnerable. "I have nothing," she whispered. The truth spilled out before she could stop it. "No family, no name worth keeping. They'll never let me live in peace." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in that low, deliberate tone that seemed to carry the weight of earth and sky, he answered, "Then I am nothing too. We are the same." Her heart cracked open. The tears that burned her eyes were not of shame this time, but of release. She pressed her forehead against his chest, the world around them fading to fire and snow. His arms folded around her, not claiming, but sheltering. By the time they returned to the cabin, the dawn had risen fully, gold spilling over the snowfields. Chenoa moved slowly, each step heavy with exhaustion, yet carried by something stronger than fear. She sank onto the furs by the fire, and Taza knelt before her, tending to the raw burns on her feet from the ice. His touch was careful, reverent. She watched him in silence, overwhelmed by the strangeness of it. That a man so fierce, so scarred, could kneel before her wounds as if they were sacred. Her lips parted, the question trembling out. "Why?" He looked up, his dark eyes steady, and spoke the vow again, this time clearer. "Because I am your slave." He placed a hand over his heart, the gesture solemn. "Not to chains. To love." Her breath caught. The words struck deeper than any declaration she had ever heard. In town, men had spoken of love as conquest, as possession. But here in the cabin's quiet, she saw that love could mean surrender, service, devotion. It could mean giving one's strength not to dominate, but to lift another from the snow. The firelight danced across their faces, shadows and gold entwined. She reached for him, her hand trembling as it brushed his cheek. "Then I am yours too," she whispered, her voice breaking but sure. "Not because they cast me out. Because you saw me when no one else would." For the first time, a faint smile touched his lips, a smile like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers, breath mingling in the fire's glow. The moment was not sudden or wild but slow, trembling, earned. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his presence settle into her bones like home. Outside, the forest stood silent, the storm passed. The town would speak again, Ruthie May's tongue would lash, Silas's pride would fester, but none of it mattered now. In this cabin of fire and silence, they had found a truth stronger than gossip, stronger than shame. When the flames dimmed low, they remained together, her hand in his gaze unbroken. The world beyond their door could roar with judgment, but within these walls, they had carved a new law. And so the girl once cast out, and the warrior once feared, bound themselves not with vows shouted to crowds, but with quiet gestures, small acts of grace, and the strength to endure together. Their survival became their dignity, their love their rebellion. In years to come, whispers would linger. Stories told of a girl who vanished into snow, and a giant Apache who claimed her. But the truth was softer, deeper. She had not been claimed. She had been seen. And he, once a shadow on the ridges, had given himself not as master, but as servant of her heart. The fire hissed, sparks rising like stars into the rafters. Chenoa rested her head against Taza's chest, and for the first time in memory, she felt no weight of shame pressing down. Only the steady drum of his heartbeat, a rhythm she could follow into whatever storms might come. And if the world outside called them ruined, so be it. They had found something the world could not name, something forged in silence, tempered by snow, bound in the simple vow he had spoken. A slave, not to chains but to love,